Okay, so I'm going to show you how to do a simple two-part silicone mold. What I'm going to be molding today is this. It's a replica of the solid eye system from Metal Gear Solid. As you can see, the back, I've actually carved in a slot in the back. That's just so I can house batteries. Now, the reason why I'm doing a two-part mold is because of this compartment on the back. Before, I did a very simple box mold for this, which was in one single part, and it looks like this. Now you can see that this is just gonna, when I pour liquid plastic in here, it will give me a completely smooth back without this compartment in it. And because whenever I make these, I always have to make this compartment, I thought it'd be easier if I just molded it so that the compartment was already there. Now, because it has this detail on the back, that is the reason why I have to do a two-part mold. So, to do a two-part mold is pretty simple. All you have to do is you have to find a way of separating the actual part into two pieces. Now, most people use clay for this. If you're going to use clay, you have to make sure you use, and you're using silicone, you have to make sure you use something that has no sulfur in it, because sulfur inhibits the cure of silicone. So what I'm using here today is wouldnt NSP, which stands for non-sulfurated plasticine, I believe. And I'm using the soft version. I'm just using the soft version because it just means that for molding purposes, it's a lot easier to manipulate. So basically, because this is really simple, there's not much I have to do with the clay. When you make a two-part mold, you have to try to think about where the parting line is, because there's always going to be a little bit of cleanup near the seam of the two parts, where there's going to be a little bit of resin or a little bit of plastic that's seeped out of the seam. So I'm going to put the seam line right along the bottom edge here, as you can see. That would just mean that I can easily sand off the excess with a bit of sandpaper right on the edge very quickly and easily once I've actually got the part finished. So to put the seam line there, I have to make it so that the clay goes up to there. And because this is such a simple piece, all I have to do is literally just press it into the clay. So I'm just going to make this slightly wider so it actually has enough space. Hopefully. Once I have the clay ready to press the piece into, the next thing to think about is how you're going to make sure that the two halves line up. Now, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to make some registration points. This is very easy to do in clay because it just means, because you can just carve in sort of grooves into the clay. That way, when you pour the silicone in and it sets, it will run into these grooves that you carve in, and it'll have sort of bumps and raised areas where you can make the other half register to. That just helps you keep the seam lines nice and tight and make sure there's no warping in the final piece. So I've spread that out nicely now, and if I just press that in slightly, just to make sure the silicone doesn't actually get underneath the piece itself. One thing to note is when you're molding something, you want to make sure the surface is exactly as you want it. So it should have exactly the right texture you want, be exactly as smooth as you want, whatever. You have to make sure that you've got it exactly right, because silicone produces almost perfect detail. So if you have a tiny surface scratch, it'll show up. Right, so I've pressed it in. You can see the clay is right up against the edge. You can see there, the clay is right up against the edges of my piece. It's not perfectly right on the edge because, well, I don't need it to be perfect because it's quite a simple piece, and I can sand, as long as it's on the bottom edge, I'll be able to sand it off quite easily, no matter where it is. Alright, so now that I've got it pressed into the clay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a toothpick and I'm going to make some registration marks. Most people would do sort of dots with a clay tool, just sort of like so that has almost like small pegs. Once you're happy with the amount of registration points you've made, the next step is to build up walls around the outside of the clay. This is because I'm doing a two-part box mold. This just allows me to actually pour in silicone and fill it all up and do it all in one layer. So I'm going to add the walls in clay because I'm running out of sort of this kind of foam core wall, material that I usually use for walls. But clay works just as well. It just means that you won't have quite as clean cut an edge of the mold, but that doesn't matter as long as the actual surface of the mold that you're pouring into is okay. So I'm going to do that now. Once you have the walls made, you can then move on to actually pouring the silicone in. One note I'd like to make though is because silicone is quite thick, it will flow, but it will also trap air bubbles. Now, because it's so thick, it sometimes has trouble running into areas that are either deep or quite thin. So as you can see on the video, there are these slots I have in here for the straps. These are quite thin and deep, and there's also this area around the light housing, which is also quite thin. Silicone is going to find it a little bit difficult to get into these areas. So when I'm pouring my silicone, I'm going to make sure that these areas get covered by using either a brush or a toothpick. Just swirl it around in there a bit and make sure that I fill this area before I put silicone all over the top, because otherwise that will trap a large air bubble here and it will ruin the entire mold. So now I'm going to move on to Okay, so now that I've left the silicone to cure, I can now remove the clay. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll show you what to do for the other half. Okay, so I've removed most of the clay now. You can see where the grooves and divots I made in the clay have actually now become raised, and they're pegs, which I can now use as registration points. I'm going to clean up the mold a little bit more, remove all this clay, and I'll show you the steps you have to take in making the second half of this mold. Okay, now that I've cleaned up the first half of the mold, I've rebuilt the clay wall around the outside of it, and I have added on air holes as well as a pouring spout here, which is wider. Now I added it to this half because this is the back of the piece, which is not going to be seen. This means that it will be better to have all the air holes and things like that on this side, as any imperfections caused by the sprues left behind will be on the side that cannot be seen, and so will not affect the actual visual properties of the piece. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to pour the second half. I'm just going to make a note that you want to make sure that your pouring spout is on the highest part of the piece. This way it stops air from being trapped and stops you from having large air bubbles in your finished casting. I've added quite a few air release areas by using toothpicks. If you find that air is still being trapped in certain areas of your mold, you can always use a drill to make new risers to let air out. Before pouring the silicone in for the second half, I'm going to make sure that I give it a good coat with ease release. What I use is Man ease release. This is good for releasing silicone two-part molds. Make sure when you're buying a release agent that it's actually a silicone release agent, as in it will release silicone on silicone rather than plastics on silicone, as that's what most ease releases are for. Okay, so now the second half has cured. I separated them both, and here are the two halves. You can see that there are grooves where where I made grooves in the clay. This makes it really easy to line them up and actually reduces the flashing by a lot, and makes sure that your piece doesn't get warped. This is actually the first casting out of it. It's actually got quite a bit of flashing, but it's really easy to remove. I can just snap it off. You can see it just snapping off right there. Yep. And I think a few minutes, maybe a minute or so, sanding that with a low grit sandpaper will get rid of all of that. On the underside, you can see some small sprues left from all the air runners. These also just snap off, and I can easily sand those down with a low grit sandpaper. This is the actual pouring spout. You can see it because it's much larger, and that just snaps right off. You can see it's actually virtually bubble free. The only one I could find is right there, and that's on the back, and it's very small as well, so you won't actually be able to see that anyways. But yeah, so it turned out very well. Surface is nice and smooth, not very many, actually there's no bubbles on the actual surface of the mold. So all in all, it's done quite well for itself. So yeah, that's how you make a very simple box mold. I would suggest one thing before you actually cast into your mold. Make sure you spray it with a releasant that's meant to be releasing silicone against polyurethane plastics or whatever plastic you use to cast, because that will just help make your mold last longer. So I hope you guys learned something, and I'll catch you next time.
If you liked that video and you want to see more tutorials on how to make your own props, replicas, and things like that, then head over to my channel and subscribe. And if you really like prop replicas and you want to keep up to date with what I'm working on, then head over to my Facebook page and like it. The link should be in the description below. And finally, if you want to see me make a specific tutorial, or if you want to see me make a specific replica or prop, then leave your suggestion in the comment section below.